Before this story continues, please allow me to make one thing clear. The story you are about to hear is a fictional narrative created for entertainment and educational purposes. It is designed to reflect toxic family dynamics and the inner journey of a woman who endured silence for too long. All characters, events, and situations are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person or real event. Some parts of this content may be supported by AI tools during the creative process. This story does not promote harm, hatred, or wrongdoing in any form. It is told to evoke empathy, reflection, and personal growth, especially for women who have sacrificed, endured, and been hurt within their own families. All content is advertiser-friendly, aligned with YouTube community standards, and does not intend to target or imply any real individual. If you see a part of your own life in this story, stay until the end. And if your heart is touched, share your thoughts in the comments or follow the channel to continue walking with stories for women who have carried too much for too long and still deserve understanding and respect. I am Leora Bennett. I am 28 years old, and I live in Toledo, Ohio, a city quiet enough that people assume help is always nearby, and distant enough that it rarely is. I work as a medical billing coordinator at a hospital near downtown. My job is to read denial letters, interpret codes, and explain to families why care stops when money runs out. I understand the system. I just do not control it. My son Noah is 6. He loves Lego trains and lining them up on the living room floor until the track makes a perfect loop. He was born with a rare heart complication. Not a miracle case, just a chance if we moved fast enough within a window that doctors kept repeating like a countdown. My parents live 20 minutes away in Sylvania, a clean suburb with trimmed lawns and quiet streets. My father Richard is 62, disciplined, precise, and obsessed with being realistic. My mother Elaine is 60, soft-spoken, careful, and always balancing both sides, until no side feels protected. My younger sister Hannah is 25, works in marketing, and was planning a wedding everyone called once in a lifetime. The night everything shifted, I was still wearing my hospital jacket when I stood in my parents' living room. In my hands was a printed estimate for treatment, $97,000, and a letter stamped with prior authorization denied. My father did not let me finish my sentence. He said they were not taking money out of retirement for something experimental. He said experimental the way people say optional. My mother placed her hand on his arm and softened the blow by saying, "I should not make my sister's year about my crisis." Their voices stayed calm. No one raised their tone. No one said anything cruel out loud. That was what made it worse. They spoke as if we were discussing a purchase, not a child. They spoke the way people do when they are turning down a car upgrade or a vacation. I realized in that moment they were not asking about Noah because they already had their answer. They did not need details, they needed boundaries. They talked about retirement, about planning, about being responsible. I nodded. I folded the papers. I said I understood. That night, after Noah fell asleep with the monitor humming softly in the corner, I sat at the kitchen table and read the denial letter again. I folded it carefully and placed it into a new folder. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I learned something that night the hard way. People do not show you who they are when you are winning. They show you when you are asking for help. And that was the night I stopped asking. Before you judge what I did next, tell me this. Have you ever been called dramatic while you were fighting to survive? After that night, I went back to the life I already knew how to live. I woke up early, packed Noah lunch, checked his medications, and drove him to school before heading downtown to the hospital. Billing was never a job you romanticized, but it was honest, and it paid enough to keep the lights on. Every day I sat at my desk reading denial letters and coverage limits, translating coded language into human consequences. I saw families realize in real time that care ended when numbers stopped working. I watched people get reduced to line items and percentages. It made me careful with money, not fearful but precise. Noah liked routine. After school, he spread his Lego sets across the living room floor and built train tracks that looped back into themselves. He named the engines after colors, not people, and he always saved the red one for last. At night, we cooked simple meals and watched the same science show because he liked predictability. I was not desperate in the way people imagine. I paid my rent on time. I had a small emergency fund. I just did not have $97,000 sitting anywhere, and no amount of budgeting could make that appear. The difference between being stable and being wealthy is invisible until you need it. My family had a way of talking that made everything sound reasonable. At dinners, my father would say Hannah never asks for much, and everyone nodded even though she had never paid for a phone plan or car insurance or a security deposit. When I asked for help, it was framed as an exception. When she received it, it was framed as support. Richard liked comparisons. He said Hannah planned her life better, and he said it without malice, as if it were a neutral observation like the weather. Elaine followed with reassurance that landed like a weight. She told me I was strong and that I would figure it out. She said it often, and it sounded like encouragement, but it always came when I needed help the most. It was the kind of praise you give someone when you are done offering anything else. The pressure to keep things quiet arrived quickly. Elaine asked me not to make a big deal of the situation with extended family because she did not want to worry people. She said church was a place for prayer, not panic. Richard warned me that if word spread, it would make everything harder. I learned that keeping the peace meant keeping my mouth shut. Hannah texted me links to bridesmaid dresses with heart emojis and wrote that she needed me to be present. Present meant smiling, standing still, and not mentioning hospital appointments. I said okay more than once because I did not want to be the person who ruined something joyful. My calendar filled with fittings, tastings, and planning calls that had nothing to do with my son. I showed up and nodded and made sure to ask questions about flowers. The unfairness was subtle, which made it harder to name. Nobody told me no directly after that first night. They simply redirected. When I mentioned insurance appeals, Richard said those processes took time. When I asked about a loan, Elaine said she did not want to set a precedent. They used careful words that sounded thoughtful. I did not argue. I listened and took notes. I have always kept records. It started as a habit from work, but it became a form of control. I tracked dates, payments, messages, and decisions. I kept a separate account that I added to slowly, and I never touched it for daily expenses. I had learned early that stability was built in boring ways. Years before Noah got sick, I had volunteered on a small community health board that partnered with the hospital for outreach. It was not prestigious, but it taught me how decisions moved through departments and who signed off on what. I knew which offices mattered and who actually read appeals. I did not advertise that knowledge. It was not power the way people imagine power. It was access to process. I knew the right departments. I just did not have the right number. The escalation came quietly. One afternoon, while reviewing statements, I noticed a charge on my parents' account from a wedding planning firm, dated the same week they told me retirement funds were off limits. I did not confront them. I did not ask questions. I wrote it down. The amount was not the point. The timing was. That night, I sat at the table after Noah went to bed and stared at my notes. I felt the urge to explain, to justify, to demand consistency. Instead, I closed the folder. I understood something then. If I reacted, I would be framed as emotional. If I stayed quiet, I would be expected to endure. I chose quiet, but not the kind they expected. I kept showing up to work, kept building Lego tracks with Noah, and kept answering group texts about the wedding. I learned to hold two truths at once: that I loved my family and that I could not rely on them. The realization did not explode. It settled. And it changed how I moved through every room after that. If you have ever been the responsible one who gets punished for being quiet, comment, I get it. I waited a few days after that first refusal because I needed to be sure I was not asking out of panic. At work, I watched families do what I was trying to do: gather documents, ask questions, appeal decisions, and try to make a plan before the clock ran out. I knew what the hospital needed to see and what an insurer needed to hear. In April 2019, I received the first denial letter for Noah. Prior authorization denied the language polished and bloodless. I filed an appeal the same day. In May 2019, the specialist sat across from me and explained the next option with calm precision. He said the window was 3 to 4 months at best, and that delay changed outcomes. I nodded like a person who could breathe normally, and then I walked out to my car and sat with my hands on the steering wheel until my fingers went numb. That was when I decided to ask again, not for sympathy, but for a loan with terms like adults who claimed they valued responsibility. I drafted a simple loan agreement on my laptop at the kitchen table after Noah fell asleep. It was plain English. No fancy language. Just names, dates, and repayment terms. I included an amount $97,000 and a schedule that assumed I would take extra work and cut everything that could be cut. I printed 2 copies, stapled the pages, and placed them in a folder beside Noah's denial letter. The next evening, I drove to Sylvania and sat at their dining room table under a chandelier that always made me feel like I was 10 again, waiting to be graded. Richard read the first page and pushed it back as if it were a restaurant menu he did not like. He said, "If we do this, where does it stop?" He did not ask how I would pay or what collateral I could offer. He said, "Precedent, the way people say poison." Elaine looked at me with her careful face and said my tone was getting manipulative. I had not raised my voice. I had not cried. I had brought paper. But in her mind, the act of asking twice was already bad behavior. I felt my cheeks heat and forced my hands to stay still on my lap. I said I was not trying to manipulate anyone. I was trying to save my son. Richard leaned back in his chair and sighed like I was exhausting him. He said maybe if I had not chosen to have a kid with the wrong man, I would not always be in crisis. The sentence landed clean and sharp. It was not shouted. It was delivered like a lesson I should have learned years ago. I stared at him and felt something inside me go quiet in a way that scared me. Elaine made a small sound and pressed her lips together, not in disagreement, but in discomfort that the line had been said out loud. Hannah was there too because dinner had been scheduled around a wedding planning call. She tapped at her phone and looked up long enough to say, "Stop making everything so heavy, it is my wedding season." Season, like this was a sport, like my son's heart was weather that should not ruin her calendar. I could hear myself breathing, and it sounded too loud in that room. I wanted to argue point by point to explain how the wrong man had been gone for years, and how my son was not a punishment for my choices. Instead, I asked one question quietly, the way I ask questions at work when I already know the answer. Do you actually not have the money, or do you just not want to use it for this? Richard's jaw tightened. He said they had to think about their future. He said there were payment plans and charities and programs. He said I worked in the system so I should be able to figure it out. Elaine nodded and repeated that I was strong and that I always find a way. That phrase again, the soft praise that meant no. I collected the folder and stood up. My hands did not shake. That surprised me. On the drive back to Toledo, I kept hearing the word precedent. I understood what he meant. He meant once they admitted Noah mattered more than comfort, they could not unadmit it. They preferred the clean certainty of saying no. The next weeks blurred together. I explored every avenue that a responsible mother is supposed to explore. I asked about payment plans and learned how quickly interest can turn help into a trap. I applied for charity programs and learned the waiting lists do not care about a 3-month window. I searched grants and assistance and filled out forms late at night with the kind of focus you only have when you are afraid to sleep. I picked up extra hours when I could. I looked for a second job that fit around school drop-offs and medical appointments. I was running a marathon in wet shoes every step harder than the one before, and I could not stop because stopping meant losing ground I could not afford to lose. One afternoon, I returned to Sylvania to drop off Noah's medication list, because Elaine had asked for it as if she were preparing to help. I walked in quietly and heard voices from the kitchen. Richard was on speakerphone with someone upbeat and professional. I recognized the tone instantly, a planner. I paused in the hallway unseen and heard Richard approve a venue deposit for Napa. The number was said like it was nothing, and he confirmed it would be paid that week. The same week he had looked me in the eye and called my request unrealistic. I did not step into the kitchen. I did not interrupt. I turned and walked back out to my car with the medication list still in my hand. I sat behind the steering wheel and stared at the dashboard until my vision cleared. My chest felt tight, but my thoughts were precise. They had money. They were spending it. They were simply not spending it on Noah. Be honest, if this were your grandson, would retirement still be the headline? By the time summer settled in, the wedding had become a machine that never shut off. The family group chat lit up from morning to night with updates about venues, fittings, menus, timelines. Photos of table settings replaced conversations. Polls about napkin colors got more attention than messages about real life. I sent updates about Noah when I felt brave enough to do it. Short, factual messages about appointments or test results. The little checkmark showed they were seen, and then nothing followed. No questions, no acknowledgements, just silence that felt louder each time. The machine kept moving whether anyone responded or not. Elaine called to remind me about a tasting scheduled for a Saturday afternoon. She said gently, "Please do not bring hospital talk to the tasting. It is supposed to be a happy day." I agreed because it was easier than explaining that happiness does not exist in compartments. Hannah pulled me aside during a dress fitting and whispered, "Can you at least look happy in photos? People will notice." She said it like a practical concern, the way you remind someone to stand up straight. I nodded and practiced a neutral face in the mirror. The humiliation was not dramatic, it was casual. It came wrapped in requests and reminders that framed my reality as an inconvenience. Richard began mentioning upgrades in passing as if they were small adjustments. He said they upgraded to the premium package at the venue because it made things smoother. He said it saved stress. At one point, a printed estimate lay on the counter, and my eyes caught the total before I could stop myself. $370,000. I did not read every line. I did not need to. The venue number alone hit hard, followed by catering and photographer. These were not abstract figures. I saw them the way I see balances at work. They were real money moving in real time. I stood there holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold and felt my stomach drop. I said nothing. On the drive home, I replayed the number until it stopped feeling like a mistake. Back at the hospital, my days grew longer. I started making calls I normally would not make for myself. Not to ask for favors, but to ask about process. I spoke to people whose jobs involved pushing paperwork from one desk to another. I knew who could move an appeal faster and who actually reviewed cases. I used the same calm, professional tone I use at work. I could speed up paperwork. I could not print money. Each small gain felt meaningless next to the clock. The machine kept grinding forward. Group chats turned into countdowns. 30 days to go, menu finalized, seating chart locked. When I mentioned Noah was having a hard week, Elaine responded with a thumbs-up emoji, and then sent a photo of centerpieces. I stared at the screen and felt something hollow out inside me. One afternoon, while reviewing statements at my parents' house because Elaine asked me to help organize paperwork, I noticed a new document in a folder marked wedding. It was a line of credit agreement approved months earlier. My name was nowhere on it. The amount was enough to cover the upgrades without touching retirement. My hands went cold. They had options. They chose how to use them. I closed the folder carefully and put it back where it was. I did not confront anyone. I did not cry. I understood the shape of what was happening. The machine was not careless. It was intentional. That night at home, I watched Noah line up his trains and felt the weight of every number I had seen. I sat at the table after he went to bed and wrote the date next to the discovery in my notes. I kept my handwriting neat. I knew this mattered later, even if it did not change anything now. If you have ever watched people celebrate while you were barely holding on, share this. Someone needs it. The delay did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived in pieces that looked harmless on their own. A form routed to the wrong department. A scheduling conflict that pushed an appointment by a week. A request for additional documentation that had already been submitted. I called every day. I documented every call. I learned which extensions went to voicemail and which ones reached a person who could move a file from one queue to another. Still, the calendar kept turning. The specialist stayed calm and factual. He explained that timing mattered and that outcomes changed when decisions were postponed. He never raised his voice. He never promised anything. One afternoon he asked me to sit down. He said he was sorry and that we were past the optimal window. He said it the way professionals do when they have said the sentence before and will say it again. I nodded because I understood the words even if I had not prepared for their weight. I drove home slowly and parked in front of my building and sat there until the sun dipped low enough to blur the edges of everything. The hospital became a place of routine rather than hope. Noah slept more. The machines sounded the same. The staff remained kind. I focused on being present without asking questions that no longer had answers. When I called my family, I kept my voice steady. Hannah answered once and said she could not miss the final fitting. She said it quickly like she was late for something important. Elaine said they would come right after rehearsal. Richard paused and said the timing was difficult. He did not explain what it conflicted with because we all knew. I did not argue. I marked dates. The escalation arrived in a request that sounded reasonable on the surface. Elaine asked if we could move the memorial by a day because out-of-town guests were arriving and the schedule was tight. She said it was just logistics and that everyone wanted to be there. I stared at the wall while she spoke and felt a calm settle that scared me more than anger ever had. I told her the date would stay as planned. She sighed and said she understood even though nothing in her tone suggested acceptance. Through all of it, I spoke very little. I did not yell. I did not beg. I listened and noticed patterns. They were not busy. They were prioritizing. On the day the doctor delivered the news, I checked my email out of habit. At the top of my inbox sat the wedding itinerary, a neat schedule of tastings, fittings, rehearsals, and travel times. I read it once and then again. 2 timelines ran side by side on the same screen. One measured in hours and one measured in heartbeats. I closed the laptop and sat with Noah until he fell asleep. In the days that followed, people came and went with soft voices and careful words. I thanked them and kept my face neutral. The memorial was small and quiet. I noticed who arrived and when. I noticed who left early. My parents came briefly and stood close together like guests waiting for the next obligation. They hugged me and said they were sorry. Then they checked the time. I watched them walk away without feeling anything sharp. That was when the stone settled. If you are still here, I need you to remember this moment, because this is where everything changed. Time moved forward because it always does, even when you do not ask it to. Between 2020 and 2023, my life shifted in ways that were quiet and practical. I stayed at the hospital but moved out of billing and into an administrative role focused on revenue integrity. It was not a promotion that came with applause or a corner office. It came with responsibility and longer hours, and the expectation that I would notice problems before they became public. The pay increased enough to matter, and not enough to change how I lived. I kept the same apartment for a while. I drove the same car. I did not celebrate anything. I showed up early and left late and learned how decisions actually traveled through an institution. I learned which reports people read and which ones they ignored. I learned how documentation became narrative when it was organized correctly. I was invited to join the hospital foundation as a volunteer first and later as a board member. It was not glamorous. It was meetings and budgets and careful language. It was also access to people who understood credibility. Through that work, I met editors who ran local community newsletters and reporters who covered health issues when there was something verifiable to print. I met people at church who cared deeply about accountability and who forwarded emails without asking many questions. I did not talk about my past. I listened. I learned how information moved through rooms without raising voices. I learned that telling the truth was not about volume, but about order. While I rebuilt myself, my family continued as if nothing had happened. My parents traveled and posted photos from places with warm light and smiling faces. They talked about being grateful. Hannah had a child and announced the first grandbaby online with professional photos and captions about blessings. Noah was not mentioned. I saw it and felt a familiar tightening, and then something steadier underneath it. I took screenshots and saved them without comment. I did not correct anyone. I did not post my own story. Silence became a tool rather than a wound. I spent evenings organizing a folder that grew thicker over time. Denial letters went first with dates and reference numbers. Then the wedding payment schedule with deposits highlighted and dates aligned against my notes. Then messages asking me not to bring hospital talk to events. I built a timeline month by month so that anyone reading could follow it without knowing me. I added one photo of Noah, and only one because it was not a display. It was evidence of a life that existed. I labeled everything clearly. I checked it twice. I did not rush. Some nights, I closed the folder and sat still for a long time. I made myself a promise during that period, and I did not write it down. I would not explain myself again. I would not chase understanding from people who had already chosen comfort. I would let the truth stand on its own when the time came. The rebuild was slow and intentionally unremarkable. I paid off small debts and added to my savings in predictable increments. I kept my separate account untouched. I volunteered where it made sense and declined attention when it did not. I learned to tell my story with documents and not tears. The escalation happened quietly in the background as my parents continued to live well and my sister reshaped her identity around motherhood. Each post that erased Noah made the folder heavier. Each vacation photo sharpened the contrast. I did not feel angry all the time. I felt prepared. By the end of 2023, the folder was complete, and my voice was steady, and my life was no longer fragile. I was not powerful in the way movies describe power. I was credible. I had relationships built on consistency. I understood systems and timelines and how quickly narratives change when evidence is presented cleanly. I closed the folder and placed it where I could reach it without looking. I did not need to rehearse what I would say. I needed to wait. January 2024 arrived with a phone call I had known would come eventually. Elaine called first and did not bother with small talk. She said things were difficult and that Richard had lost a major source of income after an investment collapsed. She said there was a foreclosure notice and that everything felt overwhelming. Then she said the sentence she had saved for last. We are family. I listened without interrupting and let the words sit in the air. An hour later, Hannah texted and told me to be the bigger person. She said people make mistakes and that holding on to the past would not help anyone now. She did not mention numbers. She did not mention Noah. A day later, Richard emailed and attached a scanned notice with dates and amounts. They needed $95,000 to stop the process and buy time. The number was close enough to feel deliberate even if they did not say it was. I replied once and said we could talk. We met at my place in Toledo on a quiet afternoon. I chose my living room because it was small and plain and there was nowhere to hide. They arrived together and stood awkwardly until I gestured for them to sit. I did not raise my voice. I placed the folder on the coffee table and said one sentence. Before we talk money, we are going to talk truth. Richard tried to speak, and I held up my hand. I opened the folder and slid the first page forward. It was the denial letter dated April 2019. I said nothing and waited. Elaine looked at it and then away. I slid the next page, which showed the appeal date and the specialist note from May with the window clearly stated. Richard said we have been over this, and I asked him to read the date out loud. He did. The room stayed quiet. I slid the wedding payment schedule next, with deposits highlighted, and dates aligned to the same week they told me retirement funds were off limits. Hannah shifted in her chair and said this was not fair. I said fairness was not the topic. Truth was. I told them my conditions without embellishment. The first was that they would say out loud that they chose to fund the wedding instead of helping with Noah treatment. Not that they were confused or afraid, but that they made a choice. The second was that they would sign an agreement to have no contact with me going forward. No calls, no messages, no updates delivered through other people. The third was that they would accept that I would not speak badly about them. I would only send documents. I would let facts speak without commentary. Richard asked if this was necessary, and I said it was the only way. Elaine cried quietly and said they did not know it would end the way it did. I said you knew enough to plan a $370,000 wedding. Hannah stood and said I was being cruel. I said cruelty is pretending something never happened. I asked again for the words. Richard looked at the folder, and then at me, and said they chose the wedding. He said it quickly as if speed would make it easier. Elaine repeated it in a softer voice. Hannah did not say anything. I placed the agreement on the table and a pen beside it. They signed without reading. I noticed Richard handshaking and Hannah scribbling her name with sharp strokes. I wrote a check for $95,000 and slid it across the table. The room felt lighter and heavier at the same time. They stood and thanked me and tried to hug me, and I stepped back. I walked them to the door and closed it without another word. I waited until their car pulled away before I sat down. Then I opened my laptop and sent an email with the timeline packet attached. I sent it to the church prayer chain with a brief note that asked for prayers for accountability. I sent it to the extended family group with a subject line that said timeline. I sent it to a few parents and colleagues who had asked over the years how I was doing. I did not add commentary. I attached documents. I closed the laptop. My phone vibrated within minutes. A woman from church asked if it was true. That was the moment the shift began. Information moved faster than any argument ever could. I did not refresh my inbox. I made tea and stood at the sink and watched steam rise. I was not rich. I was not protected by power the way people imagine power. What I had was understanding of systems credibility built over time and a network that shared information without drama. The truth did not need my voice. It only needed order. When the noise outside grew louder, I sat quietly and waited. The fallout did not look like a courtroom or a headline. It looked like people quietly stepping back. Within days, friends of my parents stopped calling them. Invitations dried up. The church hallway became a place where conversations ended early, and eyes moved away too quickly. Elaine still showed up for a few Sundays, but you could feel the awkward air around her. People who had once hugged her lingered at a distance as if closeness might stain them. Richard stopped going entirely after a month. Their country club circle froze them out in the way polite communities do not with confrontation, but with exclusion. Membership renewals became complicated. Dinner plans vanished. The social world that had once been their armor turned into a mirror they could not stand to face. Hannah tried to fight it at first by insisting I was unstable and bitter, but the packet contained dates and receipts and messages in their own words. Arguments could not compete with documentation. Eventually, she moved out of state for what she called a fresh start. She posted about new beginnings and new seasons and never mentioned why she needed them. Richard found work again, but not the kind he had before. A lower-paying consulting role with less status and fewer doors open. He carried it like an injury to his pride. Elaine started therapy according to a mutual contact and stopped posting online entirely. They kept their house because I gave them the money, but the house no longer felt like a symbol of comfort. It became a place they stayed inside. Months later, they tried to reach out again. Not directly at first because the no-contact agreement was real and they had signed it. Elaine sent a message through someone at church that said they were sorry and that they did not know. Richard left a note in my mailbox with a few lines about regret and family. I did not reply. When I eventually saw Elaine in person by chance at a grocery store in Sylvania, she approached slowly and said they did not know it would become what it became. Her voice sounded small. I did not raise mine. I said you knew enough to plan a $370,000 wedding. I said it evenly without anger. Elaine flinched as if I had slapped her, but I did not move closer. I simply let the sentence sit between us. The older I get, the more I realize some people confuse peace with silence. Elaine had always wanted peace. What she really wanted was my silence. I walked away with my cart and felt my heart steady instead of heavy. Later that night, I thought about how many years I spent explaining myself, trying to make my pain sound reasonable enough for other people to honor. When a woman stops explaining, it is not because she has nothing to say. It is because she finally believes herself. I did not hate them. Hate takes energy and intimacy. What I felt was distance. Family is not DNA. It is who shows up when it is inconvenient. That lesson was not poetic to me. It was practical. It shaped where I gave my time and who I allowed into my life. I did something small with a portion of my money. Not a grand gesture, and not something I announced. I set up a modest community fund through the hospital foundation in no name. It helped cover transportation vouchers and small medication gaps for families who were stuck waiting on approvals. It was not enough to save everyone. It was enough to keep some people from falling through cracks while paperwork crawled. I attended the first meeting and listened more than I spoke. I watched a grandmother cry quietly when she learned a ride to a specialist appointment would be covered. No cameras, no speeches, just relief. That was the kind of closure I could live with. I went home that night and sat in my kitchen in Toledo and felt something like quiet return to my body. Not happiness and not victory. Just peace that belonged to me. If this hit somewhere personal, subscribe. We tell these stories so people stop feeling alone.